Hello and welcome to the Hole in My Heart podcast. This is episode 235, the most important part of parenting.
You nailed that alliteration, Stephen. Welcome to the Hole in My Heart podcast, where we talk about how the gospel is good news for everyone every day. I'm your host, Lori Krieg, and I don't have Matt here. I do have Steve with me, who is the most professional radio voice among us, and my friend. Hi, Steve.
Hi,
Are you excited?
Lori.
Are you excited to have Dan Allender here?
Yes. Is this his third time on, or is this the second?
At least his second.
Yeah.
He is awesome, and he's going to be talking to us about his new marriage book called The Deep-Rooted Marriage. But he's going to do it because the theme of this spring part of this season, although it's still winter, I'm going to say spring and just speak it into being, is parenting or discipleship. As we mentioned in the last episode, if you are a human being following Jesus, you love him, then you are called to make disciples, which that's parenting, that's in producing fruit and making disciples. I cannot wait for you guys to hear this episode. Full disclosure, we already recorded the interview, and Steve and I both need another therapy session. Also, an applause for that was awesome.
I'm definitely going to get the book. I mean,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing. Okay, Steve, talk to us, though. For those people who don't know Dan Allender, who is he?
Well, Dan Allender is a pioneer of a unique and innovative approach to trauma and abuse therapy. After receiving his Master's of Divinity from Westminster Theological Seminary, Dan earned his PhD in counseling psychology from Michigan State University. Dan founded and served as president of the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology from 2002 to 2009, and then founded the Allender Center to help train leaders to engage others' stories of harm. Dan continues to serve as professor of counseling psychology at the Seattle School, and he's written many books, including the book of focus today, The Deep-Rooted Marriage.
All right, without further ado, let's officially welcome Dan Allender to the show. Welcome, Dan.
Lori, Steve, so good to be with you both.
And we're going to get to know you a little bit on a different level right now, and let our listeners get to know you. With the question of the week, the question is, what is your birthday dinner? If it's your birthday, what are you going to order or request to have served to you?
It's very simple. Lemon meringue pie. Nothing else.
Okay.
I don't need anything else.
Lemon
but
meringue.
I do need a really well-crafted lemon meringue. The meringue is the absolute most difficult part of the pie.
So true.
And only a really brilliant baker can do so. And my dear friend Linda Bussey offers me every birthday a lemon meringue pie. And I'm not going to spoil it by having any other food.
He's just grabbing a fork and going to town. He's like, happy birthday to me. I love that. For myself, I would love it.
Let me also add,
please.
It's not a pie that I share with anyone, including my beloved wife, Becky.
It's your birthday.
My birthday.
Yeah.
Maybe this will be some of your secret marriage ingredients for later. It's one pie per birthday per person. I love that. For me, I love a good creme brulee with that fine crack on the top for my birthday, but I want a ton of fruit. I need a fruit to brulee to creme perfect ratio. So I'm right there with you, man. But I liked this listener response.
My name is Bree. I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan. My ideal birthday dinner would be anywhere with pasta, where you get a free dessert, but they don't have to sing to you to be able to get that free dessert.
No singing.
I recently was at a restaurant where they came out with a very large neon light-up sign. They got the entire restaurant's attention, and then they sang to you with a sparkler stuck down into the top of the cake. Oh. So as long as I get free dessert, but we don't have to do all of the fanfare, I am happy.
Very true.
Free dessert, no fanfare.
I went to a steak restaurant recently, and they made this 16-year-old boy get onto this fake horse, and they sang to him. And I was like, oh, this poor boy. Please don't make him do this and sing to him. It was terrible. Steve, How about you? What are you having for dinner, and which listener response came out to you?
I liked what Sarah said and kind of put an idea in my head. She said, 2 years ago, I would have said surf and turf, lobster and a good steak. And I was like, yes, done. But then she went on and said, now I'd take a meal my dad made 12 years ago if I could. I'd have it every birthday the rest of my life. He's gone now, and back then he could really cook, so that's not an option. She says now just something I don't have to cook would suffice. A really good quality home-cooked meal would be ideal, but
Preach.
I signed on for the surf and turf myself. Yeah.
Well, Dan, thanks for joining in with our joviality. But we'd love to hear this. We've had you on the podcast before and we've asked you this, but I love your story of how really Jesus found you. So for those of us who are new listeners to the Hold My Heart podcast, we ask every guest this question. If part of the gospel is we are more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe, yet at the very same time we are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope, how was that gospel first good news for you, and how is it still?
Well, I think the beginning of my relationship with Jesus began with my best friend, Tremper Longman III, and who is a renowned Old Testament theologian. And we met at age 13, and he began sharing with me about the good news of the gospel. And it struck me as absurd and idiotic. And I humiliated and verbally tortured him for probably, about 7 years. And yet he was kind, faithful, generous, playful. And we are, well, to this day, best friends. So the gospel to me is a relationship of a friendship, a passionate commitment, but also bold and playful. And so that relationship opened the door. Indeed, I spent many years, euphemistically, I'll say, in illicit pharmaceutical sales. And even through that process of being a drug dealer, my best friend remained honoring, faithful, telling the truth, but inviting me. And in that context, due to a contract put out on a number of our lives, the gospel all of a sudden made sense because the thought of dying, at about age 20, 21, opened up something of a desire for what had been spoken for years. So that was the context. And what I would say is the brokenness I knew and was, it always changed. I'm a much more mature man, but I think part of maturity is understanding even more clearly what forgiveness means. So in some sense of the word, even though I think I'm a radically different and far better human being, on the other hand, I'm more aware of the glory of what it means to be forgiven today. So that's my story.
I love it.
Okay, so Dan, we're talking this part of the season about parenting, and you've said that one of the most vital parts of parenting is working on your marriage. And so, why do you say that?
Well, our children are given the gift of watching the reality of love and life, brokenness and beauty being played out every day in the theater of our marriage. So in one sense, they are in the audience watching closely, far more closely than we actually presume. And in that, if our marriage doesn't have the ability to actually name brokenness, but also glory in one another, our children are going to be, in one sense, hungry souls looking for what they were made for. And if they don't have a taste of truth, of reality, of brokenness, that we are a mess, we are a deep mess. But in that, there is something so stunningly beautiful about how trust, how dreaming and hope together, and how indeed the mutuality and union of love creates a context to which it allures, and maybe over decades, but it allures the heart to the very nature of who God is.
So, Dan, I grew up 80s and 90s, moral majority, evangelical America, okay? And the language around marriage back then was Christian, evangelical America. We were all waking up to the divorce stats, and like everyone was freaking out. We're like, oh my word, in the church it's 50%, outside the church it's 50%. And there was like a lot of like, it felt like funding and marketing going toward marriage. But now when I start to talk about marriage, even from the stage, I just feel like everyone's tired, or it's like, it feels like they don't care. Are you seeing a similar thing? What are you seeing?
Well, I think people have been bombarded with, in some ways, the ideal of what marriage is meant to be, to a point where we all know we're nothing close to that. And so when you set the bar so high and don't tell the truth about the nature of the impact of failure, of the struggles, of how we in some sense do harm to each other, if we can't tell the truth about the reality of our own brokenness, then beauty becomes an ideal that no one can be reached, or no one can reach. So in some sense, what I'd say is the exhaustion is due to a lack of hope.
Ooh.
Wow. So thinking about parenting, I feel like there's also a lot being asked of parents right now. A lot of that kind of idealism. We have to be assertive, but not too assertive, protect, but not too much. Don't want to be helicopter parents, and, things like that. It can be, I don't know, a lot to just focus on the parenting. So where can we find time to actually focus on our marriages and kind of like balance it all?
Well, a good example is that almost 90 years ago, the average evening meal was about 90 minutes. Research indicates that the family, generally speaking, if they have a meal together, lasts less than 8 minutes. So the reality is, our children are watching our marriages, but what they're seeing is a husband and wife going in different directions, a husband and wife doing different tasks. In one sense, the madness of our very media-oriented culture is that they're watching marriages, or watching the failure of marriages, in their friendships, in other families, in their own. So in one sense, what I'd say is, this era for being married, this era of parenting, I would say is one of the most egregiously difficult I've ever seen and ever read about. So start with that. We are not in an easy period for love to grow. But if what we do in our labor of living, if we forget that love is the most important thing we offer ourselves and our children, then what we're going to be saying is, it may cost us financially. It may not provide us with the best retirement in the future. But I'll tell you, at the core level, if you don't grow love, something else will grow in its place. And it is ultimately indifference, which is, in some sense of the word, the harshest form of hatred. So you've got a choice. You're going to suffer if you love. You're going to suffer if you don't. What kind of suffering do you choose? So that's why even 5 or 10 minutes of engagement about reality opens the door to, again, this reiteration, a growing capacity. It's sort of like when people say, I don't have time to work out. Well, do you have time to do 5 sit-ups, 5 deep knee bends? Look, something is better than nothing. And yet what we do is we set ourselves up for some ideal. And then because we can't reach it, we virtually do nothing. That is a form of madness that we are all trying to say, folks, 5 minutes of hard, good conversation is way better than nothing.
Okay, can you speak a little bit more into that? Because here's me, you're currently reading the parenting book that I wrote, and I'm in the process of editing. And so there's so much of me, even while as I'm writing that, I'm like, okay, how can I help parents do even 5 minutes of devotions with their kids, 5 minutes of eye contact? But then I also hear what you're saying right now, and I'm like, dang, that super isn't enough. Like, we need to have a goal of, I want a love relationship with my kids, and however that whatever that costs, I want that. And I want that with my spouse too. So I guess, can you speak a little bit more into that tension of not being too idealistic and yet not being too, you can parent your kids in 3 minutes a day?
Well, let's just say the interaction with my children began with a level of honesty where by the age of 4 or 5, my children were able to name thematically the nature of some of my deepest failures. And when my oldest daughter was 5 or 6, and she looked at me and she said, "Dad, you have so many issues with anger." And I understand from being with your mother why that might be the case, but you need to deal with this, or you're going to keep making me feel very alone. You're causing me to put bricks in my heart between you and me. Dang. And I'm like, oh my gosh, my daughter just named my anger. She names the complexity of my relationship with my mother, and then she names the consequence are bricks in her heart. And she eventually said, it's your job to take those bricks down.
What did you do?
Well, I'm like, part of me wants to just weep, other part like applaud, and the other scream at her.
Yeah, that seems right.
So what she's naming and what they eventually came to name is the nature of the complexity of the relationship between Becky and me. Dang. And they know I'm verbal and angry. They know Mom is kind but avoidant. And naming thematically the structure of what they're seeing. You see, I come back to this notion. Your children are seeing reality, whether you want them to see it or not. They're seeing your goodness. They're seeing your failures. If we can't name that together as a marriage, then we don't have the capacity to name that and allow our children to name that in the interaction with one another.
Can you talk then for a hot second, because this is so good, about the steps you and Becky took then to get healing? Because there's someone right now who's hearing that and they're like, oh, snap, that's us. I have a kid who could say that or just said that 5 minutes ago. What did you guys do? Because you're the Dan Allender. How did you guys got help for your marriage? Can you talk about that for a little bit, what that looked like?
Well, and again, this is going to seem too simple, but it's absolutely true. You cannot change what you don't name.
Yeah.
And it's a lifetime to name patterns, structures, where they came from. The book's title is The Deep-Rooted Marriage. And the notion of what many of us do with weeds is we cut them off at the surface. Well, what happens when you cut a weed off at the surface? The roots get stronger. So part of the work of marriage, and therefore part of the work of parenting, is to allow truth to come to the surface in a way in which it opens the door to the deeper roots that are there. And that reality of being able to go, well, I'm not just an angry person. I'm not just a verbal person. It worked in my family of origin to be angry, to keep my mother at bay. But my verbosity was what kept my mom, who was a deeply troubled woman, alive. So my story needs to be known by my spouse well enough and deep enough to be able to engage that. Eventually, our children need to know our stories. Yep. Each and every detail, no, age appropriate. But my children, let's just say my oldest is 45, they know our story. Mm-hmm. And I mean, they know the dark, the dangerous, the heartbreaking, but also the glorious and the wonderful. Mm-hmm. So again, over a lifetime, we have to help our children have language to name the reality they're seeing in the interplay of the two people who are the drama that gives them a taste of the glory of God. And that means they got to know my wife. They got to know me. They got to know what they're engaging. And so to be able to say to our children, yes, I've struggled with anger from just being a young boy. And you can pray with me and you can name that and you can engage that. It's not going to go away. It's not going to magically be resolved. But the process of growing in maturity is a family affair. Every one of us is meant to grow to become more like Jesus. And when we share the ultimate goal of becoming like him so that we're all part of that process, it just changes the dynamic of a home.
I mean, I'm picturing, the final scene of Les Miserables. Have you ever seen that musical? The final scene, Valjean finally exposes his life to Cosette, his daughter. This is the kind of man that I was, and it's like it's a deathbed confession, essentially. But there's so much like healing that happens and resolution that happens in that moment, and you think, what if you had done that like 10, 15 years earlier? Like what if she knew you as that man for more of her life? How would things have been different? Anyway, sorry.
That's great.
Well, no, it's such an important phrase because Jean Valjean really couldn't share because of the consequence of being pursued by, let's just say, a view of the law, which indeed is without grace, that is founded on utter cruelty. And hatred. So when we actually, again, go back to that phrase, begin to tell the truth, redemption is part of glorying in not mere change, but in the pursuit of God on our behalf. Therefore, it is gratitude that changes the heart, not the demand to become a different person.
Wow.
All right, Steve, what do you got? Can you even think to ask another question?
Yeah, no, that's such great stuff. So you've already kind of spoken to this a little bit, and I'm thinking about the importance of fostering that emotional intimacy in your marriage, and what are some of the principles, if you're doing that would translate to emotional intimacy with your kids? Like, can one inform the other? Is there a connection there? Is there a way that we can work on this and learn from this, and then also experience that with parents and kids?
Well, I think one of the most important things, Steve, is that we're committed to entering and engaging story. And the notion of story. Like, I knew there were facts about my wife. I knew that she had a very angry mother. I knew she had a very playful but troubled father. But I didn't know her story. I knew some facts about it. She knew facts about my life. But over a lifetime, have we entered the stories of one another to understand what has truly shaped us, both good and ill, to become who we are? And that's part of the work of why you have a family meal that lasts longer than 8 minutes, is to invite storytelling, to invite the process of children being able to go, how was school? Fine. No, that was never possible. Our children knew they had to tell stories when they came to the meal. And I didn't give a rip, actually, if the story was 100% true. I wanted them to narrate something of their life. So they learned at a very young age. Stories involve a kind of plot, character, movement of dialogue. So when they told a story, they had to take on characters. They had to be their teacher and then tell from the teacher's standpoint what they were saying to them. So when we begin to invite people to story, they also begin to knock on the door of, Dad, what's your story? What was your day like? Well, again, because I am primarily a therapist, I'm obviously not going to be telling the stories of my clients. Nonetheless, there are stories that evoke from the work I do with people, stories that tie to my own life, past and present. So when you begin to allow stories, do you know the stories of your husband, wife? So our work is to, in that sense, go back to the roots. Can we know one another deeply enough that we can begin to dig around and to begin to extract the roots that are not indeed healthy and live in order to, again, see good fruit develop at a very different level?
I'm picturing Matt and I talking even this weekend, and we did something. Like, I said something that bugged him. He said something that bugged me. And then all of a sudden we were in our our usual like tension point that we can get to. And we've worked through this many times, but maybe anyone who's in either close friendship or in a marriage, you know your tension point and what it feels like to be in a fight. Not like screaming at each other, but it's a fight. And there was this moment where Matt started uprooting things in my life, and I was so annoyed. But we've been married almost 16 years now, so I'm learning to not be as aggressive when I'm annoyed and to just notice and not take myself so seriously. But he pulled it up, he pointed at the weeds, and I was like, I know he's right. And I had to literally walk away for a little bit, and we came back to it several hours later. Can you talk to us, maybe like coach us as married people or people in close best friendships about that uprooting process that can happen? Like, how could it go well?
Your term tension point, I would also use the word trigger.
Yes.
We need to know one another's triggers.
Yep.
And each person has different triggers because each person has different, and I'll use a word that many people will ignore and go, oh, that's not me. But we all have our trauma, whether it's severe trauma like sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, or the trigger of being bullied in school, or the trigger of having a parent who could never really hear your own heartache without dismissing it with a kind of saccharine spirituality. When you begin to look at what has shaped you, what has formed triggers, if you as a spouse don't know what triggers your spouse, and therefore know what the deeper soil is that holds, in one sense, the causation or the creation of that trigger, then you don't have enough empathy, but you also don't have enough wisdom to be able to engage those moments. And those are the two qualities. I want you to grow in wisdom and deep compassion for the heartache that has brought about these patterns. Now, it's not an excuse. It's not blaming parents or others, but it's a wisdom-based orientation to now being able to go, as my wife will do. She'll name at certain points, you're growing in contempt for me, and I need you to take a walk. And I'm like, ugh. I can feel that judgment against something she said or done. And in her naming contempt, which is, from my standpoint, the number one killer of almost all intimacy in marriage. Yeah. When you hold the other with a certain degree of judgment, a kind of like, ugh. Well, at that moment, most people either fight or flee. And on either case, what happens is that ground becomes like a DMZ, a demilitarized zone. You because you love each other, you're going to avoid these tough areas. Well, that soil, that evil will plant really dark seed to grow a kind of discontentment, disappointment, just a lack of joy. And over decades, wow. Again, decades. What we're seeing now is what's called gray divorce. People in the 45 to 50 range and then above divorcing. That's the highest rate of divorce is 50 and above. Why? Because couples have not had the courage to enter into the DMZ that they have chosen to escape because they're getting triggered. If we could own triggers and indeed what the root system is, we've got a chance to not only hear and engage one another, but actually have wisdom, not to avoid, but to engage well what indeed is some of the heartache that a marriage is meant to indeed redeem. I mean, we are the face of God to one another in a way in which no one else on the earth will play that role on your behalf. And if I don't know you, then I cannot bring you a taste of what the goodness of God offers.
Okay, so I feel like there's a lot of experts that will talk about communication. Like this is a good category to address in marriage. You know, we are different creatures. We speak different languages. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Like, what are your thoughts on just kind of like communication, improving communication as a method to improve marriage?
Yeah, I've always not liked the Venus Mars.
Right.
I'll just say men and women come from east of Eden. And in that, the brokenness of our own gender-related failure, men so much more sensitive to being humiliated, a woman so much more attuned to being alone. So in that context of the failure to name, what has the brokenness of the fall brought to each gender in the way that we communicate? And the typical categories of communication, I'm all for, but we don't even address that directly, in the new marriage book. Why? Well, a lot of people do. But again, I'll go back to when we are failing to communicate, it isn't because we don't know how to use I versus you messages. It's because there is something blinding us. And so the issue is, what's the log in your eye? How is it that you don't see well? And we often think that's just sin. Well, yeah, but in some ways, I failed to see my wife because if I were to see her heartache, not only am I partially responsible, but I've got to learn to grieve with her. And I don't want to have to grieve. I don't want to have to, in one sense, suffer her life with her, whether I've caused it or not. So what I'd underline again is you begin to communicate well when you suffer on behalf of the other. You learn to shut up, or you learn to speak, or you learn to slow down, or you learn to speed up. Do you see? That's why I don't think there's a way to communicate. There is a way to engage. What's keeping me from being able to see you and know you as you are and as you are meant to become?
Okay, I want to circle back to something because this is, it's like an earworm in my head that I need to hear more because it was so genius. You said because you truly do love your spouse, like you got married for a reason, there's these territories in your marriage that you don't address at all. And then it gets tons of weeds in it, but you're like, it's fine. We're all fine here. I can't even see you anymore over these weeds, but we're good. Can you just talk a little bit more about that? Because I'm like, that is so true. We just completely avoid it. And then meanwhile, it's going gangbusters with all these weeds. Can you talk a little bit more about the turning toward or what we can do if we notice that in our marriage?
Well, COVID sent me essentially in a world of being at home other than being on the road. And that brought me into the kitchen, which is my wife's territory. And all of a sudden, the tensions that started to grow were pretty severe. And a lot of it came down to I didn't squeeze out the little towel that we put in the kitchen. And that issue of, wait a minute, a dish towel isn't totally dry after being used. How could that possibly cause conflict between the two of us? And my wife is like, why can't you just do something thoughtful with regard to caring for our kitchen? And I'm like, how is it possible that you are that OCD that you have to have every particular thing in the... So it became a war. And again, not laughable, heartbreaking. It was a war. And what it opened the door to, there was a particular moment where I opened the refrigerator and I said to my wife, we have nothing to eat. And she came over and she goes, here's tonight's dinner. Here's tomorrow night's dinner. Here's the next night's dinner. And I'm looking and I'm literally looking into the refrigerator going, it's empty. And she's going, there's food. So, I mean, literally, we are fundamentally looking at reality in radically different ways. And she looked at me and she said, what was it like for you when you opened the refrigerator door when you were a boy? And I looked at my wife and I was angry. We were angry. And that one question, all of a sudden, tears. I literally started to cry. And I'm like, I don't even know why I'm crying. But she stayed with it and she said, "What was it like when you opened up the refrigerator door?" And my response was, "Totally empty. Maybe several pieces of ham and a piece of cheese, nothing." And she began to say, I don't know the story of what it was like to grow up with your mother in the context of how she handled food. Well, let me tell you, the next, shall we say, second, the tears dried up and I was enraged because I didn't want to talk about something like that. But it took weeks of engagement to begin to develop an understanding of why there was so much war for me in my wife's kitchen, because I had never dealt with what was in my own family of origin's kitchen and the relationship between food and heart and engagement. So it's back to that simple point. Do we know one another's stories? And if we do, we can begin to engage. And as my wife said, eventually, you have a deep food insecurity, not as a judgment, but as heartache. And her phrase was, it's as if you grew up in a crack house. And I've never understood how that would actually play itself out in relationship in this world. When we know one another, our hearts will break and will not excuse, but we'll invite one another into a far deeper process. Now, I handle that dish rag really differently now. I don't feel compelled in a kind of fear-based, but it's a way to honor my wife. And I'm much clearer why the war in the kitchen is a realm for me to become a far more mature man.
2 lemon meringue pies for you. That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, Dan, I just want to thank you just for sharing this wisdom. For me personally, married 33 years, and this has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
I feel like so much of what we teach and what we write in books about marriage is about its techniques to avoid suffering. And to me, what you're saying is, would you, because you love this person and because of your commitment to this person, will you enter into that suffering? So that's what I'm taking away from it. Thank you. That said, we often like to end our podcast episode on a note of hope. So I don't want to say, would you share something to help people avoid suffering? But would you share something for listeners who maybe are feeling like the Lord is calling them into a journey of healing and a journey of learning their story and maybe their spouse's story or their child's story and vice versa? What hope would you offer that person who's at that point right now?
Well, I just have one simple thought, and this comes again from Lori's new book that people will fully delight in, but it's creating a foundation. You don't have a choice as to whether or not your foundation's going to be at times overwhelmed by the waters, but love conquers all. Love never comes back void. So even in facing failure, when there is this heart to bring something of the heart of God, the love of God to one another, even in the face of failure, what I believe to be absolutely true is death never has the final word. Love does.
Thank you.
Man, Dan, I really appreciate you. I just learned so much when we just chatted about the film project we get to partner on soon. I'm like, I quoted you like 5 times to 5 different friends. I'm like, oh my gosh, I love him so much. So I can't wait to see you in person soon for that film project. But thank you so much for sharing your heart and your mind, your wisdom, and your stories today.
Well, what a delight to be with you both.
Okay, we just said an official goodbye to Dan, and Steve and I just looked at each other and I said, isn't he the best?
I mean, full disclosure, I just came from a therapy session, so maybe it's that, but like I was not able to like follow the script. I was like so engrossed and engaged in what he was saying, and yes, I usually need a script to follow. Just another full disclosure there. But so I don't know if my questions made any sense because I was
They did.
yeah, it was.
No,
man.
you did great, Steve. And I'm like trying to say, okay, so guys, everybody go get his book. Let's go read The Deep Rooted Marriage. So that's going to be a link there, as well as to Dan's sites. But right now we're going to reflect, and we want to hear from you guys. You can email me at podcast@lorikrieg.com, any of your thoughts, or message me on the Hold My Heart Podcast Facebook page or on Instagram what you think. What was the takeaway then, Steve? What are you right now, like, what are you like, oh my gosh, I need to think about that for a little bit more?
Just entering into someone else's suffering and their pain and their story.
Yeah.
Kelly does that really well for me. She just instinctively has that. And also she has the Holy Spirit, so it's not just her own Kelly instincts. But anyway, she also has worked on it, so I want to do better at that.
What he said, like where I circled back to, wait a minute, there's these territories we don't want to talk about because we genuinely do love each other. Like, I think that can be maybe a posture that we say is like, no, you guys are just conflict avoidant and you hate each other, and so you don't do these hard work. And you're like, actually, it's out of love. I'm just, yes, conflict avoidant. And
Right.
I don't want to hurt you and I don't want to hurt me.
Right.
But the benefit, like that example of him in the kitchen with Becky, where she entered in with loving courage, and to his loving courage to look inward. Like, that is an element, like he said, wisdom and what else? Wisdom and like love or something like that. We got to circle back and listen again.
Right.
But the requirements to be able to have those hard conversations is just, it can change your whole marriage. It can change your whole home. It can change your friendships.
And I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that person on my deathbed with my kids who says, okay, here is your dad. Here is my story. You know, like, I'm not going to wait until then.
Jean Valjean.
Right. But yet, in your everyday, you know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't feel like monumentous enough to be like, okay. But if you are fostering that as like just part of the culture of your family, then that kind of unfolds. Anyway, yeah.
And then what he said too about like, not like, take 5 minutes a day if that's what you got, but make it a priority to cultivate love in your home and in your lives, like with time and eyeball to eyeball and being your goofy real self. I loved that. Okay. I need a therapy session now. I do have a question of the week, though, for you guys next time.
Oh.
It's winter, which means I'm to the point in winter where I don't even check the weather anymore. The weather in Michigan is cold.
Yeah.
It's cold. That's it. 20-something and freezing.
Cold and may or may not be snowy.
It might snow, might not. It doesn't
Right.
matter to me. I don't even check it anymore. What are your winter must-haves? In order to like get through this baby, what do you need? For me, I need candles at all times. I like literally, I have candles all over my house now and lighters everywhere, which in retrospect maybe isn't wise with kids also everywhere.
Oh,
but
right.
whatevs. We're fine at this minute. Candles, tea, and slippers. I have to take them. What about you, Steve?
I totally am with you on the slippers.
Right.
Last Christmas, my kids got me those fuzzy Ugg slippers.
You have Uggs? You
I
have
do.
actual Uggs?
I don't wear them outside the house.
Because you'll get laughed at.
Well, and also they're slippers. They're meant for inside the house.
Yes.
I've got a very hard and fast rule about that. Need to take the trash out. Oh, I got to switch my shoes. Anyway, also this Christmas, one of my kids got me this big fuzzy robe.
Oh man, you're just leaning into grandpa style.
Totally. When I'm home, when I'm like in for the night, it's the robe and the slippers.
I've been longing for a robe. My girls, though, are to the ages where they steal everything of mine. So I had one for about 1 hour after Christmas. And Gwen has it. Anyway, what do you guys think about the podcast? What is your answer to your 2 winter must-haves? Find us on the Hold My Heart Podcast Facebook group. Follow me on Instagram, and you can answer it. If you like the podcast, feel free to take time to rate and review. Guys, thank you so much. Dan Allender, good grief. Thank you, too, to WCSG for hosting us, to the Zach of all trades and the Hunter in the woods. He's always going to be in the woods now. I'm sorry, Hunter. That's your name, so that's what I call you. I've never even met you. I bet you're an amazing person. He's the intern who turns around my videos super quick. So does Zach, but it's Hunter. He's killing it, isn't he, Zach? We appreciate you. Anyway, thank you, the listener, for joining us today, and for all of us here at the Hold My Heart Podcast. We'll see you next time.